Good morning. If I could ask everyone to take a seat, please. Got quiet all of a sudden. Thank you. Very obedient. Good morning, and welcome to the Authority's Annual General Meeting. I am Glenda Geese. I am the chair of the Authority's Board of Directors, and I'm going to be acting as the MC for the AGM today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishtabik, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. On behalf of the Authority's Board of Directors, I would like to thank you for joining us, both in person and via webcast. We have over 100 people registered to join us today in person and well over 100 online. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. For those in the room, the washrooms are out that door to my left, to your right. And in the event of an emergency, I would ask you to please proceed to one of the doors marked with an exit sign. For those attendees joining us online, please note that you can enter your questions directly into the Enter Message box on your screen and submit the questions by clicking Post. The questions will be received by Authority staff here in the meeting room. Joining me on the stage are Frank Denton, the Authority's CEO, and Pat Moran, the Authority's Registrar. Frank and Pat will each provide information on the Authority's 2018 activities following my remarks. I'm glad to see many familiar faces in the room, some of whom I had the opportunity to say hello to before we started, and I look forward to meeting those I do not yet know. The turnout for this, our third annual general meeting, suggests keen interest in the Authority's role in Ontario's waste reduction and resource recovery efforts. As a regulatory authority of the Government of Ontario, we are accountable to the Minister of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, to the public and to our stakeholders, including those of us who have joined us today. Our mandate is to support Ontario's waste and litter reduction strategies by administering the Waste Diversion Transition Act and the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. These acts and how the Authority implements its mandate profoundly impact the businesses that supply designated products and packaging, those who use these products and packaging, and the municipalities and companies that then manage them. 2.5 years after the Waste-Free Ontario Act became law and established the Authority, the transformation in the way we manage waste in Ontario, laid out in the Act, is well underway. Today's meeting, along with our annual report that we published earlier this month, are two key public disclosure and accountability opportunities for the Authority. Because supplying products and packaging and managing end-of-life products and packaging both contribute to our economy and affect our environment now and into the future, it is important that the Authority reports publicly on the work that we do. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions after our remarks. We welcome your questions and comments as your feedback helps us deliver better services. We are moving from a system based on collective producer responsibility delivered by industry funding organizations to a system based on producers being individually responsible and accountable for their products and packaging at end of life. This evolution is another step in Ontario's history of innovative approaches to reducing waste and litter. Ontario was the first jurisdiction to introduce Blue Box curbside collection. When Ontario residents embraced the opportunity to recycle, the province recognized the need to close the loop between supply and recovery by involving producers in the management of the products and packaging they supply. The objective of the next step in this evolution, led by the Ontario government and supported by the Authority, is to provide more choice to businesses in how their products and packaging are collected and managed once consumers dispose of them, to spur innovation and ultimately to increase Ontario's recycling rate and reduce the amount sent to disposal. 2018 was a pivotal year for this transformation. The tires regulation came into effect on July 1st, 2018, making tires the first material to transition to the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. Tire producers are now individually responsible and accountable for meeting collection and management targets for used tires. With the introduction of the tires regulation, the authority began delivering on its key mandates to maintain a registry for registration and reporting and to enforce the requirements set out in the tires regulation. We successfully launched the registry for tires in July, and we began exercising our compliance and enforcement function. We also worked closely with Ontario Tire Stewardship to manage the transition as the used tires program was wound up and tires became subject to the individual producer responsibility framework. The authority approved OTS's wind-up plan for the used tires program in April of last year and oversaw implementation of that plan until the program was wound up on December 31st. I would like to thank OTS and its staff for their collaborative efforts throughout this process and their commitment to ensuring a successful transition. I'd like to especially acknowledge OTS's Executive Director, Andrew Horstman, for his dedication and hard work, both administering the used tires program during its decade of successful management of used tires and then during the wind-up process last year. Andrew's long history with OTS and his depth of experience in the tires sector were especially helpful in managing the issues that arose during transition. I would also like to thank Bruce Campbell, OTS's administrator, for providing effective governance and oversight of OTS during the wind-up process. Our experience winding up the used tires program will be instructive as we move forward to transition other programs from the Waste Diversion Transition Act to the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. In February of 2018, the Minister directed the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment program operated by Ontario Electronic Stewardship to be wound up. OES submitted its wind-up plan to the authority in December of last year, and the authority consulted on the proposed plan earlier this spring. The authority's board will be considering approval of the plan to enable OES to begin winding up the WE program. In April of 2018, the minister directed the wind-up of the Municipal Hazardous or Special Waste program operated by Stewardship Ontario. We look forward to receiving Stewardship Ontario's wind-up plan for the MHSW program and then consulting on the proposed plan and considering approval later this fall. Late in 2018, the minister accelerated the wind-up of the batteries portion of the MHSW program to coincide with the wind-up of the WE program. The authority's foundational work in 2018 has positioned it to support the wind-up of the WE and MHSW programs and, if directed to do so, wind-up of the Blue Box program. The minister's directions have established momentum in this transition process, and the minister's discussion paper on reducing waste and litter released earlier this spring suggests there is more to come. As the Ontario government moves forward with reducing waste and litter, the authority is ready to support that process by monitoring the province's resource recovery systems through collection and analysis of information reported to the registry. None of the authority's accomplishments in 2018 could have been achieved without effective governance. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Board of Directors for their commitment and their counsel, which have helped guide the authority through its early years. I will ask each board member to please stand as I call your name. Tom Wright, who is the authority's Vice Chair and Chair of the Governance Committee. Joyce Barretto, who has been the authority's Corporate Secretary. Ken Kaywall, who is the authority's Treasurer and Chair of the Finance and Technology Committee. David Brezer, who is Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee. Sakib Chima, Andrea Nempton, Robert Poirier, who's not in the room at the moment, but who will be joining us shortly, Rajesh Sharma, Mary Shenstone, who is actually out of the country at a family event and sends her regrets today, and Nidhi Tandon. Thank you to my board of directors. I'm grateful to the authority's board and to the authority's staff for their expertise and their diligence and for consistently striving to efficiently and effectively deliver the authority's mandate. I would like to thank our various partners, businesses, municipalities, and the environmental advocacy sector for their willingness to collaborate with us. And I would like to thank Minister Rod Phillips for his guidance during his time as minister, and also thank staff at the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks for their ongoing support. Our accomplishments were only possible through effective coordination and collaboration among all of those with an interest in improving resource management and recovery in the province. 2019 will be another milestone year as we prepare to transition electronics, batteries, and municipal hazardous or special waste to the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. I look forward to your continued engagement and support as we each contribute to Ontario's progress towards a waste-free future. And with that, I'd like to now invite Frank to provide further information on our activities in 2018.
Thank you, Glenda. Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful sunny day, just as it was a year ago in the same venue. We had to make a strategic decision this morning. Do we keep the blinds open so the sun can stream in and nobody can see the slides, or do we close? I think maybe we should have put it to a vote, but I hope we get those blinds up very soon. I've been reflecting on the many conferences and events I've been to lately on the circular economy and waste diversion. I've met lots of people at these, had lots of good conversations, learned a lot of things. Many of you are in the room. When I leave these events, I always feel deeply inspired by the change that's coming to Ontario. There's a big change coming. I would like to give a similarly inspiring speech today. Unfortunately, that's not why we're here, and I'm not in a position to do that. This is just the annual general meeting of the regulator. We're the regulator. We're not the government. We don't get to make the rules. We're not industry. We don't have to be innovative and figure out how to operate in these emerging markets. We're not an environmental NGO. We don't get to express opinions about what the government should or should not do. That's for others to do. So, but if I can inspire you, I will talk about, help you understand what we do, how we're trying to do it, and what we've done through 2018. So it's been a big change, a big period of change for producers, municipalities, the industry, for the authority, lots of new things happening. We all know the goal: to transition Ontario to an economy where products and packaging are collected, reused, recycled, and reintegrated back into production someday in a never-ending loop for all products. That's a big aspirational goal. One of our objectives at the authority is to try to be a facilitator and support the collaboration when it comes to understanding and adapting to a very complex sets of rules that will be coming forward in succession as the government passes regulations. I'll start by reminding you of our structure and mandate, which is set out in our legislation set by the Government of Ontario. We were created, as you know, 2.5 years ago. November, I know the date, November 2016. Our objects are to perform the duties and exercise the powers given by our legislation and to provide information to the public and to the people involved in resource recovery or waste reduction. So it always strikes me I have this one kind of global, do what you're told to do in the legislation, and then this calling out of providing information, which really drives the way we're trying to deliver our mandate through communication, which you're going to hear more about. Our job is to implement the government strategy. That strategy comes piece by piece, one regulation at a time. Everything we do flows from our legislation, from those regulations, from our operating agreement with government, and from the directions received from the ministry. We don't get to design the mandate. We don't decide our scope of operation. That's given to us by the government, and we figure out how to implement it as effectively and efficiently as we can. We take a lot of direction from government in the form of the regulations and direction letters, but we're independent of government. If you read our operating agreement, you can see that there's a very tight accountability relationship between us and the ministry, both on paper and through conversations. We have regular, sometimes daily conversations with the ministry as we try to figure out how best to implement the policy that we're given. We're also accountable to the businesses, all the businesses we regulate. We have a particular accountability to the businesses that are paying our costs, which are producers today. We're a not-for-profit organization. We receive no government funding. We have an independent board, 11-person board you've been introduced to. 5 of those 11 are appointed by the minister. 6 are elected by the board. So it's that makes it on paper and in practice an independent board. So what's our mandate? So first, we are here to oversee the wind-up of the 4 programs currently under the Waste Diversion Transition Act. That job's done for tires. The job for tires isn't done, but the transition out of the WDTA into the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act is complete with the wind-up on December 31st. We continue to oversee waste electronics, municipal or special waste, Blue Box, until those programs are wound up. The second part of our mandate is to regulate the businesses under the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act, the RRCEA, and its regulations. As a regulator, our job is to support the businesses who need to understand and comply with their legal obligations. When the government makes regulations, you need a regulator, and our job is to support the businesses and to maximize compliance, and that's what Pat is going to speak about later. We have been doing a lot of communication to try to fulfill that mandate. Over the last 2 years, we've met with many people, we've talked to a lot of people, we phone people, we email them, we text, we use social media, we have a website, we do everything we can think of to communicate to people in the best way that works for them to understand the messages. I think we've had at some point somebody said enough already, you're communicating a lot, that's great, we're starting to get it. But we do know that there are still businesses out there that are trying to adapt to some complicated rules, a rapidly evolving market, so we're going to keep doing everything we can to provide clear, concise, and simple messages to help industry understand the requirements and how they can thrive in the new environment. As Glenda mentioned, we got a lot of support from people outside the authority in delivering that. Often it's businesses can communicate to other businesses in a way that's easier to understand. So we appreciate that support. So we are a regulator. We do enforce. We have all the compliance powers that we need as a regulator. Pat's going to talk more about that later. But Pat's very big on communication, as you know. So under the RCEA, our job is to work with the businesses to make sure that producers, producer responsibility organizations, and service providers are registering with the authority. Their producers are reporting their progress in meeting their obligations, and that producers are meeting their mandatory collection targets and their mandatory management targets for their products and packaging. In 2018, our focus under the RCEA was on providing support to the business in the tire sector to help them prepare for the wind-up on December 31st. We're 6 months into this new world of individual producer responsibility. Broadly speaking, I'd say there's 2 kinds of people that are following this. There's most things. There's the glass half full people and the glass half empty people. The glass half full folks, and I include myself and everybody at the authority and many of the people in this room, I think, would say things are going reasonably well for such a major change. Tires are being collected, they're being processed, the pros have formed, they're delivering services to their customers. It's hard work for a lot of people, and there's some bumps, but no more bumps than we would reasonably expect 6 months into a new way of doing things in Ontario. For the glass half empty folks, I just encourage you to continue to be patient, and let's look at this over time and see what the impact has been on Ontario over the next few years. But I would say that one sign that we are on the right track is the very high level of compliance among tire producers and service providers in the new regulatory requirements. And I give credit to Pat and his team for that. You'll hear more about that. So a third key part of our mandate, which was a focus in 2018, was the development of the tires registry. Our legislation requires us to build a registry, and that registry aligns very closely with the tires regulation and will with future regulations. We needed to build a registry so that producers, pros, and service providers can register and report under the RCEA, We began in the fall of 2017, and we opened the registry in July of 2018. Actually, earlier than that, for the date when producer registration began in July of 2018. We worked closely with many of you in the tire sector to develop the registry. We did a lot of user testing to make sure it aligned with existing business practices as much as possible and it minimized burden as much as possible. So that registry is going to be an important public asset for many years to come in Ontario. It'll be used for the 4 materials to be transitioned from the Waste Diversion Transition Act, and potentially more materials. If you read the Minister's plan of March the 6th, he speaks about using the authority as a broader information clearinghouse for waste diversion. So we look forward to seeing our destiny emerge as we receive direction and regulations. Approving and overseeing Ontario Tire's stewardship wind-up plan for the used tires program was another important focus in 2018. In advance of the wind-up, we consulted on the proposed wind-up plan that OTS put forward. Our board's responsible for approving that plan based on assessing it for compliance with the legislation, consistency with the minister's direction. The board had the authority to set conditions. They did approve the plan in 2018 and did set several conditions on it to achieve the policy objectives of the legislation. One important condition that was proposed was to require OTS's Tredsmark system to be widely available to industry. And the board did that in response to feedback it received through consultations. Another important set of actions in 2018 was to work very closely with OTS and service providers to ensure that tires continued to flow and move to market through the fall and through the transition period. That was a challenging period. There was a lot of collaboration between Pat's compliance team, OTS, people out in industry, and we got through it effectively. In 2018, we also consulted on the development of our 2018 and 2019 registry fees for tires. Maybe it's a good time to switch into our finances for 2018, which you can read in our business plan. So our revenues expenses were up over 2017, as you can see. Our budget grows as our mandate grows with minister's directions. We're not asked to take on a new program. We work through the resources we need to deliver that program as efficiently as possible, but to get the work done. And the teams we need to deliver on that need to grow. Under our operating agreement with the ministry, the authority's budget must be divided between activities, costs associated with activities related to the Waste Diversion Transition Act and activities related to the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. We're very, very careful to avoid cross-subsidization. I know that's very important to the people who are paying for this. Our RRCA expenses in 2018 were $837,000 compared to $505,000 in 2017. Our RRCA expenses were recovered through fees charged to regulated parties, and at this time, those parties being charged are the producers and the pros. Our WDTA expenses in 2018 were $5.1 million compared to $4.3 million in 2017. Those expenses are recovered through fees charged to industry funding organization and industry stewardship organizations. The increase in our expenses of approximately $1 million in 2018 compared to 2017 was due to exercising our key mandate to develop the registry and to build a compliance team to support the businesses in complying with the requirements of the tires regulation and all of the activities related to transitioning through that wind-up process. In 2018, the authority collected fees under the RRCEA for the first time. RRCEA revenues totaled $1.6 million, with $987,000 applied to 2018, including a reserve contribution of $578,000 that will be applied to 2019 expenses. WDTA revenues were $5.6 million, including a reserve contribution that compares with $6 million in 2017. So our revenues exceeded our expenses in order to establish a reserve fund, which is prudent for any organization. We ended the year with a total reserve of $2.4 million compared to $1.8 million in 2017. Our reserve policy sets the limit on a reserve at no more than 50% of our annual operating budget, and we have stayed within that. Additional details on our financial and operational performance can be found in the annual report. That's posted on our website. Includes the performance of the waste diversion programs we currently oversee and a corporate scorecard that we developed. As we continue to implement our mandate, we continue to look for ways to minimize our costs. So that was 2018. Going forward, we will use the lessons we learned in transitioning tires. Many people have said, I agree, that was the right program to start with. In some ways, it's the simplest of the programs to be transitioned from Waste Diversion Transition Act. It didn't feel simple. I just said simpler than the ones that are coming, perhaps. Next comes electronics, municipal hazardous or special waste, and we're waiting to see what happens on Blue Box. So our goal is to continue being a helpful, responsive, cost-effective regulator, and we can only do that with your support, your ongoing commitment to collaboration. I would like to thank the Board of Directors. We're blessed with a very strong board, a very active board. I want to thank my executive team for their leadership. There they are. Pat, who many of you know is a regulator, Noah Gitterman, a bit more in the background, our legal director. Wilson Lee, who found this beautiful venue and does many, many other things to drive our communication strategy. Sandra Montague, who manages a fairly complicated financial setup that we've got to work with. John Pennard, who's keeping this registry build on track, doing a phenomenal job. And many or all of you know Jeff Rathbone, who's the Director of Transition, who has a very, very deep knowledge of the world that we're moving out of and the world that we are moving into. I also want to acknowledge all of the staff at the ministry. We have done some hiring. We have hired very talented people. I'm really excited that the word on the street for young people seems to be this is a cool place to work. Something's happening. Wish we could hire you all, but we can only hire a very small few of you, the lucky ones. So I'm going to turn over to Pat, the registrar. As you know, he and I have separate roles. As the CEO, I'm responsible for the overall management of Authority's operations, accountable to the Board of Directors. Pat's responsibilities are set out in the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. He's responsible for the compliance function, including independent decision-making responsibility related to compliance. Whenever I look at our two roles, I always think Pat's got the harder role for sure, but he's doing a great job. So Pat, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and I'll remember to raise that in my next performance review. So last July, the tires regulation came into force, and on January 1st of this year, tire producers became individually responsible and accountable for the collection and management of used tires. With the introduction of the tires regulation, the authority exercised its key mandate to register and receive information from obligated parties and enforce individual producer responsibility requirements under the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. To prepare for delivering this mandate, I hired the core team of compliance and registry officers, and I appointed a deputy registrar. And it was important for me during the recruitment process to seek out individuals who understand that compliance starts with good communication, especially during a transition period, which we're going through right now. It was important to have individuals who understand that a customer service approach is compatible with and, in fact, underpins effective regulatory performance. And I wanted individuals who instinctively understand the importance of taking a gradual and proportionate approach to compliance. But most importantly, individuals who embrace the authority's core values that prioritize earning the trust and respect of the people we regulated and approaching the people we regulate with integrity and impartiality. And in going through this recruitment process, I want to thank my colleague Sandra Montague, who's our director responsible for finance and HR. She kept us organized and on track through hundreds of interviews and contributed very strongly to our success in recruiting the people that we have on board now. Some of the authority's compliance and registry officers are here today, and I hope you'll have an opportunity to talk to them. You'll recognize them by the enthusiasm and excitement that exudes from them all the time. So a major milestone in 2018 was launching the registry. The registry is the portal and database that we use to register obligated parties and to receive reports on the supply of products and packaging into the Ontario market. We also use the registry to receive reports on performance by producers relating to the collection and management of those materials when they reach end of life. It's the primary tool that allows us to ensure that compliance with regulatory requirements to recover resources that went into those materials happens, and we have an ability to see that it's happening. My team worked very closely with the authority's information technology team and our external technology partner, PwC, or PricewaterhouseCoopers. I always call them PwC, but they got a much longer name than that. So I want to thank very much again my colleague, John Pernard, our IT director, who was, again, an integral contributor to our success in managing this IT project. And I see John Bauer and Candace McKay here today from Pricewaterhouse, so, and I want to thank them again for the stellar effort that they put into designing and implementing our registry. Our approach to this initiative was to design a registry that would first, implement the regulatory requirements. Secondly, be as easy to use as possible. On that point, I always tell this story because I really like it a lot. One of our registry officers got a phone call from a 9-year-old who was calling to help his grandfather register his business as a collector, and was very successful in getting through the registration process. His only complaint was that his grandfather's Wi-Fi was too slow. But so PwC helped us design something that a 9-year-old can use. That's what we take from that. As a grandfather, I'm not sure I could use it, but I haven't tried to yet. And equally important, we wanted to minimize the regulatory burden while meeting the objectives of the tires regulation. It's so important for a regulator to approach the regulated folks that they have to deal with on the basis that they're imposing something on people when a regulation comes into play. So how did we do that? We engaged tire producers and service providers in the user testing. We received really valuable feedback that helped with the design of the functionality of what we were building. We worked really closely with our transition team to ensure that we understood how the marketplace actually works. And I want to thank Jeff Rathbone and his team for their contribution to our success on that front. They bring decades of industry experience every day to the office and contribute in a very strong way to our ability to know how things work and how to build our functionality to be compatible with that. My team also worked really closely with the authority's communications and stakeholder relations team to develop communication materials that are clear, concise, and timely to help regulated parties comply with the new requirements. When a new rule comes in, one of the key barriers to compliance is people simply don't know that there's a new rule in place, and we worked really, really hard to help people who were going to be subject to the new rules to understand that the new rules existed first, and secondly, to understand what they needed to do to come into compliance. And I want to, again, thank my colleague Wilson Lee and his team for the strong contribution that they made to our success on that front. We launched an outreach strategy that involved contacting and directly engaging prospective registrants. We hosted webinars. We participated in industry meetings. We leveraged existing communications channels, including the one from Ontario Tire Stewardship. And we worked with various associations to help educate the tire sector on these new requirements. And Wilson Lee and his people were able to turn around PowerPoints within hours when we needed them. So thank you again very much. We are also indebted to a number of stakeholders for supporting our outreach efforts. Andrew Horseman from the Ontario Tire Stewardship worked very closely with us, helping us to understand how things worked leading up to the transition and helping us understand who the industry was. Andrew, I know you're here today. I know that you sounded a little wound up at the last time we heard you speaking. Maybe this process has left tread marks on your soul, maybe, I don't know. But I do want to acknowledge the professionalism and dedication that you brought to the transition. It was, again, a key contribution to our success last year. And Bruce Campbell, of course, our administrator. Bruce and I first met many, many, many years ago at an Ontario Hydro hearing, a little hearing on Ontario's power system, the demand supply hearing. You can ask him later on if he thinks the nuclear power system is more complicated than the used tire management system. I'll leave that for him to talk about. I also want to thank Adam Moffat from the Ontario Tire Dealers Association, Frank Notte from the Trillium Automobile Dealers Association, Dave Gordon and Amber Crawford from the Associated Municipalities of Ontario. We were able to work closely with them on communications to their respective memberships, and again, that helped us spread the word to people who needed to register with us. We worked collaboratively with the newly established producer responsibility organizations, or the PROs, to reach used tire service providers to ensure that they understood their obligations. I always enjoyed speaking ahead of the pros at any speaking engagement I had, because the person would introduce me and then I'd do my thing, and then the person would introduce and say as follows, now we're going to turn it over to the pros. Anyway, so we're still working on that. We visited processors and retreaders. We met with other used tire providers to understand how used tires are managed on the ground. And we did all of this so that we could truly understand the impact of the tires regulation on those people and to incorporate that knowledge into the design of the registry. A major outcome was our ability to design reporting requirements in the registry that, to the extent possible, avoided the need to change the way tires are actually handled on the ground. So for example, with collectors, if you look at the regulation, there was 4 categories of tires and a number of things that had to be reported against each of those 4 categories by collectors. We knew that the majority of collectors were small businesses, and this was going to be something that wasn't the main part of their business. And so we needed to satisfy ourselves that we were going to ask them to report on what was really, really important for achieving the compliance objectives under the regulation. And so we stripped it down to 3 basic things from the 20 or so original proposed reporting requirements. How many tires did you sell for reuse? How many tires did you collect from outside of Ontario? And how many times did somebody show up at your place, at your collection site, with more than 10 tires in a day? We looked at how processors operate. We saw that haulers pick tires up from all over the place, that the loads are mixed. We knew that if we were going to say to processors, we want you to tell us how many tires you achieve and you received in these 4 categories, that every time a truck came in, they'd have to unload that truck, separate those tires into 4 piles, and then weigh them all separately. And we knew that that wasn't going to justify any, it wasn't justified in the context of what we needed to know from a processor. So we don't require processors to do that, and they're very happy that they don't have to do it as well. So we get the weight of the tires that they receive, and we get the weight of the materials that they recover from those, and that's what's important in terms of determining whether producers are meeting their requirements. I'd like to thank each of the pros for their willingness to work with us to help producers and service providers understand their new responsibilities, including the registration process with the authority. This collaborative relationship definitely helped to make this an easier transition than it might otherwise have been. So we've learned a lot from the first transition. It's critical to work very closely with the industry to resolve operational issues during the wind-up and transition period. Communication is a priority in order to support voluntary compliance to maximum extent, making sure that registrants understand what they need to do and when they need to do it, and making it as easy as possible for them to do it. It's important to actively support those registrants in their interactions with the authority, so we need a strong customer service approach, and we've established that. And it's important to foster a level playing field for producers, pros, and service providers. Every time somebody does something to comply with a requirement, we hear over and over again the message, if I have to do this, I want you to make sure everyone else who's competing with me also has to do it. And we agree 100% with that. The competitiveness of this new market is going to be key to the success of the new regulatory framework for used tires. That's where efficiencies are gained, that's where new technology comes in, and we're looking forward to seeing how that evolves. So we began registering tire producers at the beginning of July, and service providers at the beginning of September of last year. And by the end of 2018, we had 543 producers, which represented close to 100% of the OTS stewards that, from our perspective, would meet the definition of producer under the tires regulation. 6 pros are registered. 5 of those are active, which means that they have producer clients. So that's a good indication that there's a competitive marketplace where that marketplace has to be competitive. At the end of 2018, we had just over 4,000 collectors, representing about 4,400 collection sites. We're now at 6,300 collection sites, so that has worked out very well during this transition period. We have 121 registered haulers, 12 retreaders, and 19 processors, including processors from outside of Ontario, all of which adds up to a very strong marketplace that's going to support the success of producers when they are reporting in on their obligations. Between the opening of the registry on July 3 of last year and the start of the new regulatory framework for tires on January 1 of this year, our compliance and registry officers recorded over 15,000 interactions with regulated parties. And these weren't follow-up interactions, these were unique interactions. Voicemail, phone calls, emails, every kind of communication that we have available to us, we used it. Many of these interactions were proactive outreach by our officers to provide information and offer assistance. For example, we had an individual conversation with each potential producer before the registration deadline, and as a result, we were able to get the vast majority of those producers registered on time. Out of those 500 plus producers that registered, I would say that about 60% of them were learning for the first time about these new rules as a result of that conversation that they had with the compliance officer, and then they registered. So while we seek and prioritize voluntary compliance, my compliance and registry team also undertook inspections and other monitoring and enforcement actions to anticipate any market disruptions that might occur and to foster a level playing field. We conducted an inspection campaign in 2018 to monitor the used tires market leading up to the December 31st wind-up of the used tires program to ensure that the 2018 tires under the OTS system weren't going to be stranded during transition, left behind, or brought into the 2019 program under the regulation. We contacted every hauler, every processor, and every retreader to determine if there was any backlog in place at the time in the used tire supply chain. And having done that, in fact, we confirmed that there was a backlog, and quite a significant one. And so then we turned to OTS and worked with them to extend the deadlines under the OTS program to pay for the collection and hauling and processing of those 2018 tires. And that included working with OTS to secure additional processing capacity to make sure that backlog was brought to the smallest amount possible so that when we went into 2019, we had a clean slate to begin with. Our interventions with OTS contributed to the limiting of disruptions to the marketplace as the program wound up and as the regulation came into place. And again, I want to thank Andrew and Bruce for their contribution to that success. It also significantly reduced the risk of 2018 tires carrying over into the new program and distorting the new market. This year, tire producers are reporting their 2017 tire supply data to the authority so that their collection and management targets for 2020 can be established. And the deadline of May 31st has passed, and we've had virtually 100% reporting success at this point on the first annual report. Producers are also currently in their first performance year to meet their 2019 targets. We continue to monitor the market using our inspection powers so that we can identify potential market disruptions early and take any action that may be required to maximize the ability of producers to meet their three key obligations. The first one, of course, is to operate a collection and management system. The second one is to meet their collection target, and the third one is to meet their resource recovery targets. And we continue to work with the pros who are working on behalf of producers to make sure that all three of those requirements are met. Next year, we're going to receive the first annual producer reports on their performance against their 2019 performance targets, and we will use that to measure how successful they've been in meeting their compliance obligations under the tire regulation. As Glenda and Frank noted, the authority is actively engaged with the Ontario Electronic Stewardship on the wind-up plan for the WE program, and with Stewardship Ontario on the wind-up plan for the MHSW program and the batteries program. Once the regulations for electrical and electronic equipment and regulations for batteries and regulations for MHSW are finalized, we will begin establishing the registry for each of those materials and ensuring that we're ready to undertake and implement the new framework for each of those categories. And of course, as we did with tires, we will start by communicating with those producers to make sure that they're ready to meet their compliance obligations and aiming for the same success that we had under the tires regulation. So I'd like to also thank ministry staff for the strong relationship that we've built up. It takes two parties to have a good relationship, and John Armiento and his team have supported us in excellent ways throughout the last year, and hopefully we've provided some value back to their team as they're working on new regulations. I want to thank the Authorities Board for their nimble response to our fast-moving requirements in a very busy, changing year. And of course, I've named everybody on the executive team so far except our lawyer, Noah Gitterman. So I do want to thank him because being corporate counsel, he's involved in everything. And so he's contributing to our success in every facet. So thank you very much, Noah. And of course, the rest of our staff and my colleagues, of course, on the team for their tireless efforts during this past year. And I know there's a number of people who are here from the used tire industry, and I also want to say, while we're talking about what we did, I want to make sure that we recognize what they did. It was a big transition year for us, but it was a big transition year for the used tire marketplace as well, and they've worked really, really hard to get the systems in place to meet these new obligations, and so I want to recognize that very strong contribution from the industry, and for their cooperation and support as we worked with them to achieve what needed to be achieved under the regulation. I look forward to the work that lies ahead as we transition we and batteries and MHSW and working towards achieving compliance in those sectors with the new regulations as they come out. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you to Frank and Pat, and I'm now going to open it up for questions. I would like to ask those in the audience to please use one of the two microphones that you see sort of in the middle of the room. This is so the folks on the webcast can hear your question. I would ask that you give your name, your affiliation, before you pose your question. And for those attendees online, just a reminder that you can enter your questions directly into the Enter message box and submit the questions by clicking Post. I do want to say that among us, Frank, Pat, and I, we will do our best to answer your questions. If we don't have answers readily available, or if your question is specific to your particular situation, we will follow up directly with you following the AGM. And depending on the number of questions, if we don't get to all of the online questions, we'll follow up with the online questioners following the AGM. So I open it up for questions. Would anyone like to go to a microphone? Glenn. It's good to see you too, Glenn. I remember you from last year at the microphone, actually.
I'd like to ask some of the same types of questions, only because we didn't get...
Yep, to the microphone.
My apologies. We didn't
Yes.
get the kind of cooperation and support we were looking for last year. Hopefully, now that a year has transpired, maybe a better opportunity exists now today now that you and your organization has way more experience. Good morning. My name is Glenn Maidment, and I manage the Tire and Rubber Association of Canada. Our members market and sell 80% of the tires in the country, certainly here in Ontario. And so, as you might imagine, the tire program is quite important to us. This is a difficult, I'm going to frame this, and it's a little bit difficult because I have to commend RIPRA and the staff and the management on what they've accomplished over this period of time. You've done a lot of things that have made the transition more smoothly for my members, etc. So that's good. So you've done a lot of good things, but you've got one thing colossally wrong.
And you're going to tell us?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
To me, it is fundamentally wrong to have usurious type fees. Some of my members are paying over $100,000 a year for the privilege of registering with RIPRA. That's colossally wrong. It's colossally wrong because they have no other alternative. You could charge them $200,000, in fact, sometimes you are. You could charge them $300,000, $400,000, and they couldn't do a darn thing about it. That's a problem. The unique thing is, there's an obvious solution. You had 543 producers registered. I'm understanding your number that you're collecting from producers is $1.75 million. For something like $3,000 fee, you could achieve the same kinds of things. So yeah, our members are a little, frankly, annoyed that the tire program has basically funded the RIPRA startup for the last 2 years. We know that apparently help is on its way as the oil programs, the electronics programs comes into play and the other programs. So my question to you is, and to the board of RIPRA, will you now, with experience, begin to reconsider another model that reduces the fees to the tire producers to a more manageable level?
On behalf of the board and Frank as CEO, we have scheduled an item, a session at our August board meeting on the principles of fee setting in order to go back and have that conversation from a broad perspective. I'm not sure where that conversation will take the board because it begins in August and then proceeds in the fall through consultation with our stakeholders on our 2020 fees. But we will be having that conversation. It's on the board agenda.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions from in the room? Questions from online? No? Yes. This is somewhat familiar from last year, as I recall. We have a few minutes.
It's Groundhog Day. What can I say?
Yes, that's what.
Another question. The OTS surplus, and I appreciate that that's foggy at this point, but do you have any insight on what the status of that is at this point?
I may ask Frank to fill in if what I'm about to say is not current, but my understanding is that OTS is working through the process with CRA. So that CRA has requested information from OTS. OTS has provided that information, and I believe OTS is waiting on a decision from CRA.
And if I may, one final question. The Treadmarks program, and Frank, you alluded to it in the presentation. Producers paid for that. Producers supported it, and producers would now like to consider using a version of that Treadmarks program out of province, in another province, in other words. Is that available to us to do so?
As I recall, the condition that was placed on that was that it needed to be used for the benefit of Ontario. So that decision was made.
With all due respect, producers paid for that, and the producers are national organizations, and they operate in all provinces. The same producers who paid for it in Ontario would like to use a version of that program in another province. I don't understand what the reluctance or the reticence would be.
Well, that was a decision that was thought through. You had that position a year and a half ago on behalf of your members, as I recall, and weighing up all the aspects of it. The decision was that it should be for the benefit of Ontario. I don't believe they're in a position to revisit that decision at this time.
It hasn't come up recently, other than your comment in this forum. My understanding of the rationale for the original decision was that the fees that were collected by producers from Ontario consumers of tires were what supported Treadmarks, and there was a view similar to some of the direction that's come from the minister recently on use of surplus funds, that it should be for the benefit of Ontario. I think that was the rationale behind that decision at the time.
You're making my point on a few things. Thanks.
I do have a question from online related to the information that Frank presented on the financials. Frank used the phrase avoiding cross-subsidization when he was referring to the separation of RRCEA costs from WDTA costs. Would you like to explain that phrase, avoiding cross-subsidization?
So it's very important that as we collect fees from various sources, from the IFOs and the ISOs, under the WDTA, and from tire producers to the end of the RRCEA, that we manage our allocating those costs, those recoveries, to the expenses that relate to the people that are paying those fees. That's the intent.
And I should add to that that we internally segregate not just between RRCA and WDTA, but within WDTA between each of the programs. And I expect that when we have multiple programs under the RRCA, we will do the same. We will segregate costs by program because the fees will be set by program. So we do our best. This is partly why there was the comment earlier that Sandra Montague's job managing our finances is complex. It's because we separate, we track our costs separately by program. Sheila.
I'm Sheila Kerr with Electronic Product Stewardship Canada. I don't have a question, I just have a comment. And you know, I'm really pleased with all the information you provide. There's also an industry working group, and several members are here from different sectors, and we appreciate the open dialogue we've had. My comment is basically on the legislative framework in which you work, which is nothing that we can resolve here. But I do think that the legislative framework was ill-advised, because having a RIPRA agency in Canada where processing, which is where most of the costs go for any of the sectors, is national and international. And we need to be aligned and have a national market at the very least, if not international. And I think that RIPRA has, you know, you're a good regulator and you're doing what you're asked to do, but it has put a lot of costs on businesses and consumers. It's very prescriptive and it is costly. And I think it disharmonizes a business, and it is a business, of recycling that's national and growing internationally. And if we want to achieve circular economy, we have to keep that in mind. So I just ask you to be aware of that going forward, because I think the cost prescriptiveness can add barriers to a business that we all want to encourage. So.
Thank you. This question of being a provincial jurisdiction inside of a national country and what is a global marketplace is a subject that's come up often, and I'm hoping that it's on the agenda of the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, who are meeting right now in Halifax. Right. Other comments, questions? No? Yep, if you could go to the microphone, please. Hello, Cindy.
Thank you so much for all of the information you shared today. I just wanted to ask...
Could you identify
sorry.
yourself for the folks on the webinar? Yeah.
Cindy Coots from Yame Canada Limited.
Thank you.
You talked about some of the lessons that you learned through the tire transition, and I wondered if you could share some of those lessons learned that you will be applying to the upcoming transitions.
Sure. For me, one of the biggest lessons was we built the tire registry on a fairly compressed timeline, and that limited the amount of time we had to communicate with people who needed to know that these new rules were in place. We have a longer runway with electronics as we work towards getting the regulation in place and then building the registry towards the wind-up date. We are going to take full advantage of that extended runway to communicate beginning very, very early with people who will have to register so that producers begin to understand what the new rules are. There was a real paradigm shift in the tire world, and it's going to happen in the electronics world and the batteries world when you go from a central recycling agency to individual producer responsibility. And the moment people start to truly understand what that means, that's when we start to see real work towards coming into compliance and arranging affairs to be able to comply and making all those market decisions that have to be made and all those contractual arrangements that have to be made. So we're going to start that really, really early. The second one that I would point to is, again, very, very important. Key to producer responsibility is the role that pros play. And again, pros came into existence fairly late in the tires transition, again, because it was a compressed time frame. We were all scrambling to get ready. With the extended runway, once again, we're going to encourage anybody who's going to look at this new marketplace as a pro to come in and talk to us. We've already had people come in and talk to us about what these new rules mean. We've had some very good conversations with people who are going to be acting as pros in the new world, and we want to do that much more intensively than we had the opportunity to do in tires.
Hello, Dave.
Hi, Glenda. Thank you. Dave Gordon from the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. If I could maybe a comment and then a question. Just thought in light of the previous comment raised, certainly municipal governments are big supporters of RIPRA. We certainly have had our share of disagreements around things steward obligation and things like that. We look at those as, individual issues of disagreement, but certainly want to, just be clear that from our members, I think, as we understand this dynamic between a national level and how that might work, but we are right now, in fact, in the midst of this transition to individual producer responsibility in the province, and we firmly believe the only way that can work is with a strong, independent regulator who's overseeing that. So just in terms of our perspective, we think that's really critical and important. Onto the question, I think, is we are into the wind-up of the MHSW program. I think one of the questions we've heard a lot from our members is the vast majority of that tonnage is overseen by ISPs. And there's a little, I think, what is the process for those ISPs? So we've talked to some of them and have had good conversations with Product Care and others, but I think that maybe is something for RIPRA to consider, a little broader guidance, at least on the principle and how these things will work. I think there are some questions out there on, they are different from an IFO. How will that process sort of unfold?
Thank you. We'll take that as advice, actually. Hello, Gord.
Gordon Day with the Rise Solutions, part of the Amterra Group. We are one of the pros on the tire side, so I do want to compliment and thank RIPRA and the staff for the assistance they've provided in this process. It has been a challenging process. A couple of learnings that we've had. One is, no matter how much you are communicating with people, once you get past the big industry groups, and certainly on the tire side, Glenn's association represents the vast majority of the volume, but boy, of the 500, we're probably talking to the 400 other ones. It becomes a challenge communicating this transition. So I know you've got lots of experience in this, but this is a bit more for the other folks that are coming along. You can never emphasize the ability to communicate. And maybe it's through the other trade associations that work more closely with agricultural or transportation services or trailer manufacturing. That's inevitable. And then the other one is just the fact that transition is difficult for people, and RIPRA's been, and the team has been very patient with the producers, but it also, it is a tough challenge to communicate through this process. But again, we're still here surviving, and tires are moving, so I think we still, as a testament that the transition is working. But boy, for those people that are coming, please get out as early as you can to your members to get the communication, because RIPRA is great to talk to, and they can dispel a lot of questions and myths or issues or misinformation that's floating around. So I just wanted to pass that on.
Thank you. And we would encourage everyone to come talk to us, actually.
Could I just ignore, I mentioned that we got a lot of help from people out there in industry and in learning how to communicate and where to communicate. And Gord, you're one of the people that I had in mind. I remember a conversation probably a year ago, and a light bulb went off. You know, you're explaining it this way, try explaining it this other way, and maybe they'll get it. So I appreciate your support in this communications endeavor.
And seeing no other folks at the microphones, I'm going to close this AGM. I do want to reiterate what I said just a moment ago. We do hope that you will follow up with us with any questions that you may have today or may encounter in the future, any comments, any advice. We welcome that. We want to stay closely in touch with our stakeholders, and we welcome your advice. I do want to point out that the video recordings of today's proceedings will be available on our website by early next week. I would invite you to stay for coffee and conversation. I introduced the board earlier, and Frank put a slide of his executive team up, so I would encourage you to find those people in this room and introduce yourself to them. I do want to let you know that we are convening a board meeting shortly after this meeting, so you have a window of about the next 20 minutes where you can talk to the board members, and then they'll be leaving this room for a smaller meeting room in this building for a board meeting for the rest of the day. I would ask as you leave this room to please leave your badges behind. We will reuse them for this event next year. And I want to thank you for joining us today. We very much appreciate your time and the fact that you've come out, both in person and the time of those who are on the webinar, to join us this morning. We look forward to more collaboration, more communication, more exchanges with you over the coming year, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. Thank you.